Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Greenland has returned to the centre of US strategic thinking, with President Donald Trump once again framing the Arctic island as vital to American national security, from military positioning and great power competition to rare earth minerals and private US investment. Washington's interest is growing and unsettling allies. Joining us is Marc Lanteigne. He's professor at the Arctic University of Norway, to examine why Greenland matters so much to the US and what this renewed focus means for Arctic stability. Professor, welcome to TVP World and thank you for taking the time.
Good evening. Thank you.
Good evening to you, sir. So, when President Trump initially announced that there was no alternative but to actually take over Greenland, it understandably threw everyone into a bit of a fluster. Have things calmed down a bit? Are people thinking differently about that very explosive statement?
It really has created a lot of uncertainty. There really does not seem to be a complete understanding about what the United States wants and what it would accept as part of a deal. So the talks that are going on today in Washington were set up hopefully to clear the air, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about where these discussions will go.
So what brought this about? Although President Trump did mention taking over Greenland in his first term as president, he's come back, with some energy this time around and urgency. What's happened and what's really underneath all this?
I think there's a few factors at work here. First of all, there has been the aftershocks of U.S. operations in Venezuela. This might be emboldening the U.S. government to say, well, we can achieve some of our other aims in the Western Hemisphere. I think this is also an offshoot of what was published last month, the U.S. National Security Strategy, which put a very specific focus on the United States being the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, which includes Greenland. And the president has also been trying to push the idea that Greenland is facing a very serious security problem. Frequent mentions of so-called Russia boats and China boats threatening Greenland, even though there's no evidence of that. So there seems to be a combination of different factors at work here.
You say trying to push this narrative about Russian and Chinese threats, but do you not believe that Greenland is the strategic place that the president believes it to be?
Well, the Arctic as a whole, because of climate change, is starting to be seen overall as a security risk. And Greenland does sit next to a very important sea route, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, which there is a concern that this particular maritime space could be used for incursions by Russia, for example, submarines or ships. But that ignores the fact that the United States already has a significant military presence in Greenland. Greenland is a part of NATO, and there are many options for improving the security situation in Greenland without resorting to annexation.
So do you think, as many do, that this is simply President Trump's opening salvo, saying we're going to have to take it over, and he'll end up agreeing to something a little bit more reasonable? Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility, but it is starting to become unclear because of the fact that, as you note, we've seen some of Trump's statements on social media basically saying, well, there is no halfway point here, that the United States must take Greenland for security. So whether this is a bluff, whether this is an opening of a more nuanced deal, this is what we need to find out in the coming days and weeks.
Okay, now what does that mean why does he have to take it over? Why does America have to take it over? Why not simply strengthen it along with other NATO countries? As you say, Greenland, Denmark, both part of NATO now. Why not do a combined NATO exercise there?
That is the question of the hour, and the impression that we're getting from the U.S. government is that the only way for Greenland to actually be safe from outside incursion is for the US to possess it. Like, there have been some very strong statements, including by the US Vice President, that Denmark is not fulfilling its security obligations in Greenland. This despite the fact that Denmark has been redoubling its efforts to improve the military presence there. And it was just announced today by the Danish Defense Ministry that there will be a new set of exercises in Greenland with NATO support. So the facts really don't add up.
What does this mean if President Trump actually does go ahead with a more aggressive policy in terms of taking control of Greenland? What does it mean in for NATO unity?
The damage would be very severe. It is important to note that Denmark is a NATO member. Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom. Both the Danish and the Greenlandic government have said many times and in many ways that they do not want Greenland to become American territory. So for the United States to push this over the objections of another NATO member, this really carries the threat of weakening the alliance. And the Danish government has said as much, that this could cause very serious implications for the future of NATO.
So, leaving aside the security implications for the moment, there are quite a lot of rare earth metals to be dug up in Greenland as well. How much of a role are those playing in President Trump's decision?
I think that is a factor, although the White House has tried to downplay that. Greenland does have a lot of mineral wealth. That is everything from, as you say, rare earths to base metals, precious metals, uranium. And certainly there is the US interest in basically creating an alternative source for these rare earths, many of which are currently dominated by China. But again, the facts don't necessarily match the rhetoric. To set up mines in Greenland is a very difficult, very expensive endeavor, one which would take many years, many decades, and a great deal of startup money. And I should point out that when this whole US buy Greenland situation began in 2019, there's been no indication that the United States or any US companies are really serious about setting up mines in Greenland. So again, we have a disconnect.
Although in fact, many of the big names, the billionaires, have been raising their stakes in companies in Greenland. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and others are doing that on the backs of what it seems is President Trump's determination to control Greenland. What do you read into those investments?
Well, again, we're seeing a great deal of talk, but very little in the way of specifics. Regardless of who might be backing a new mining operation, this is a very, very difficult part of the world geographically to set up new mines. You are going to need pretty much everything but the kitchen sink to set up a mine. You need to put down a lot of startup money. You need to look at labor, infrastructure, and you need to be patient about the fact that you might need many years before you turn over a profit. And it's interesting to note that, again, we do not see a lot of enthusiasm from US companies beyond the initial rhetoric to actually start up mines, even though the Greenland government has said it would be perfectly happy to receive US or other international investment in mining.
In terms of, thinking again about the impact on NATO, would that basically mean the disintegration of NATO? Would that mean that NATO would morph into something that excluded the United States?
It is a very solid possibility. There have been disagreements between NATO members in the past, but certainly not to this degree. And many European governments are starting to think very carefully about what might happen to NATO if we do see a withdrawal of the United States. Trump has, for example, made noises during his first term that he sees NATO as not good for U.S. policy. He has made suggestions that the U.S. might withdraw from it. And I think that is starting to have an effect on a lot of the defense policies in Europe. And I think some contingency plans are being discussed. There have already been, for example, here in Norway, a new agreement was just struck with the UK to set up joint training and further military cooperation. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that in the coming weeks, depending on what happens with Greenland in the near future.
Are we seeing a new world order based on the Monroe Doctrine, where the US is basically responsible for the Western Hemisphere, China for Asia and surrounds, and Russia for everything in between?
Yes, it really seems to echo the late 19th century when we saw, as you say, the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the United States would have hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. There are a lot of questions, understandably, about what that means to American security commitments, not only in Europe and in Asia, that the possibility of blocs being created because of this is very possible. And this obviously is a great concern in Europe, because of the fact that it's now caught between a very difficult United States and obviously a very difficult Russia.
What about a very difficult China and the Taiwan situation? Does this mean that President Trump's going to take his eye off Taiwan? I mean, can he afford to risk those shipping lanes falling into China's or under China's control?
Yeah, U.S. policy towards China and the Taiwan Straits, it's been erratic at best. There have been certainly noises within the Trump government that it still wants to have a security presence. It still wants to protect Taiwan. There are ongoing negotiations about tariffs with Taipei. But there is a concern that the situation with Greenland, if you look at the Chinese press, for example, will have aftershocks in China, will send signals both to Beijing and potentially to Moscow that the United States is turning inward and that the United States is less concerned about international law.
Yes, but I mean, that's as maybe. But again, you know, the amount of shipping that goes through the Taiwan Straits is way too big and important for world trade for the US to ignore, isn't it?
It is, yes. And with the United States trying to rework its trade policy and certainly try to put an emphasis on the fact that the United States needs to have apparently better quality trade with many parts of the world, I think there is a concern that a hyper-focus on the Western Hemisphere will have also very significant aftershocks with substantial U.S. trade with the Asia Pacific. And this is being felt not only in Taiwan, but I can point to Japan, Korea. There's a lot of discussion about hedging. There's a lot of discussion about new economic arrangements. If the United States begins to withdraw or becomes less of a factor in the Asia Pacific as well.
Right. In the last minute or so that we have left, Professor, Vice President J.D. Vance is meeting with the premiers of both Greenland and Denmark in about an hour's time. What do you think's on the agenda and what outcome do you expect?
Well, the anticipation that the United States will outline its stance on Greenland, that hopefully there will be a bit of clarification about what the U.S. is and is not willing to accept as part of the negotiations. Now, as for the Greenlandic and Danish sides, they have stuck to the same song sheet pretty much all the way through, that Greenland is not for sale, that Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom, and that there is simply going to be no possibility of annexation put on the table. So I guess the question will be, is there any kind of halfway point here? Is there any kind of, let's say, economic or security deal that can be put forward that would allow all sides to save face and allow the situation to cool down? Because that's pretty much what's required right now. There needs to be a cooling off.
Indeed, there does, and we will be watching carefully to see what the outcomes are. Professor Lanteigne, thank you very much for sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Stay tuned for World News. Goodbye for now.